Hi everyone, this is Jonathan from Nintex. Today I wanted to take a look at how we could replicate some functionality that we had in SharePoint on-prem up in Nintex for Office 365. In this video, I wanted to take a look at how you can interact with Active Directory through Workflow, specifically creating groups or Active Directory groups with your workflow. Now, in Nintex Workflow for SharePoint on-prem, I'm working with SharePoint 2019 in this particular instance, we had the action create a D group. This allowed you to pretty easily go in, configure an LDAP path, send some credentials, tell what scope you wanted the group at and what group type you want, and then a name for the group, and this action would run and create all of that within your on-prem Active Directory. Now, creating groups in Active Directory in Office 365 with Azure AD is going to be a little bit more complicated than just this single action. This video is going to be a little bit more complex than some of the others that I've done. However, I am going to have a lot of the same material outlined in the blog post that this is related to. Creating groups in Azure AD through Nintex for Office 365 is really going to be a two-step process. The first is that we need an app within Azure that we can make a call to that will actually create the group for us, as the workflow doesn't have access to that particular space in Active Directory. The second piece is then going to be actually configuring the workflow correctly to call to that app in Azure so that we can create that group in Active Directory. So what we're going to do is first we're going to jump over to portal.azure.com, and then we're going to go into Azure Active Directory. Once you're here, we're going to go ahead and click on App Registration. And you'll see that I have a already created app that we'll be using a little bit later in this video. However, I'm going to walk you through the steps of how I created this app in Azure. Now, something to be aware of, I am going to be showing the client ID and the client secret within this video. I'm going to go back and delete these applications that I'm creating so people don't have access to our Azure Active Directory. However, in your case, please make sure that you keep those secret, and I'll show you a little trick in the workflow to help with that anonymity. So what we'll do first is we'll click New Registration, and we'll go ahead and give this a name. So I'm just going to call this Nintex AD Group. I'm going to leave this as accounts in my organizational directory. However, if you are using a multi-tenant, you can update that here. Down here, I'm going to select Web, and for the URL, I'm just going to give it my local host. Then we'll go ahead and say register. So here on this page is where we're going to find a couple important pieces of information, including our application ID and our tenant ID. So I'm going to just copy those to a notepad. Next, what we're going to do is go into Certificates and Secrets, and then we're going to select New Client Secret. I'm going to set this to expire in 1 year, and this will be my Azure AD key. All right, so I'm going to copy this again and add it to my notepad. Now remember, this is what you do not want to share with anybody. And again, I'm only sharing it because I'm going to delete this app after I'm done. After we've got our secret, we're going to go into API permissions. And you can see it already has for the Graph API, which is really what we're going to be calling to a little bit later. We're going to go to Add a Permission. We're going to select Microsoft Graph. And we're going to select Application Permissions. Now, there are a lot of different permissions that you can grant for this API and for this app. I'm going to go through and select the ones that I've found are needed for this step. However, if you want to add all of them, you can. If you want to do some more granular permission sets, you can as well. So we're going to go through and we're going to say Application, App Role Assignment, contacts, delegated permission, directory, domain, files, group, group members, identity provider, information protection, mailbox, and mail, and member, organization, people, policy, privileged access, role management, security, sites, teams, user notification, and user. When you select Add Permissions, you'll see this updating, and then you'll have this pending for consent. We have to wait until that's done, and then you'll essentially grant permissions with an admin, a global admin account for your Active Directory. Once you have the grant admin consent, you'll go ahead and select that. You'll get a new pop-up window, and I'm going to use our global admin account. And select Accept. You should then see your statuses go to granted. If you still have some that are refreshing, give it another moment and those should also come through. Awesome. So we're going to actually add one more permission set. So we'll go to Add a Permission. We'll go ahead and we'll scroll down and we'll select Azure Active Directory Graph. We're going to select Delegated Permissions this time instead of Application Permissions. And we're going to have a much smaller permission set this time. We'll go ahead and select Users and say User Read. Then we're going to go up to Group. And we're going to say Group Read All and Group Read Write All. And we'll say Add Permission. You'll again need to wait to grant consent. We'll then grant consent. And once everything goes to green, we'll now actually be done setting up everything that we need within our app inside of Azure. Now it's time to jump over to the workflow and see how we can configure the actions there to call to this app and create our groups in Active Directory. Here in Nintex Workflow for Office 365, the process for creating a group is really going to be a two-step one. The first is getting the access token, or our bearer token, that will let us call into the API that we just created. And then the second will actually be calling that API and creating the group. What I'm doing here at the top is setting some app properties. So this is going to be where I set the tenant ID, app ID, and app secret that we collected earlier from our app. I'm adding these to variables so I don't have to try and type them in every single time I want to use them within the workflow. This also helps with a little bit of anonymity when making changes in the workflow design. With those variables set, we'll now go ahead and take a look at what it takes to get our access token. The first step is making a web request for our bearer token. This request will be a post sent out to our login.microsoftonline.com/our tenant ID and then /OAuth2/token. This is the endpoint that we need to make our request to get our token. Our content type is going to be application whack x-www-form-URL encoded. And then the content is going to be a little bit more complicated here. And again, I'll try and have this in my blog post. But our grant type is going to be client credentials. The client ID will be our app ID because this is what we're making the call to. The client secret will be our app secret that we pulled earlier. And our resource, and it's important that this is resource and not resources, is pointed at https://graph.microsoft.com. This is because we want to get the access token for the Graph API, not any of our other APIs. And our scope is going to be user.read. I'm going to go ahead and pass in an admin username and password. And then I'm going to get my content back in my bearer token response content. This is just a variable that I've created. It's a text variable. And I'm going to store the status code in a response code, which is just an integer. When the response comes back from our endpoint, I actually then want to extract the token. And an easy way to do this is going to be setting a dictionary variable and then loading that with the response content that we got from our endpoint. At that point, I'm then going to use a get an item from a dictionary action. We'll aim it at our new dictionary. We're going to get the access token, which is actually a bearer token for those interested. And then our output is going to be into a access token variable, which is just a text variable. I'm then also logging the access token just to make sure I got back the right response. Now that we have our access token, we can actually now make our call to our app up in Azure and create that Active Directory group. First step is actually going to be putting together the group content that we'll use for this call. There are a couple parameters that are required when creating groups in Azure AD. If you'd like to look at these more in detail, Microsoft has some great documentation on that. However, in this case, it's display name, whether or not the group is mail enabled, the mail nickname, and then if it is a security group or not. So in this case, I'm going to use the display name of Alpha Test Group. My mail enabled is false, mail nickname is SRI, and my security enabled is true, as I want this to be a security group. I'm then going to log all this as the group creation body, which is just a dictionary variable. Finally, we're going to put everything together in our web request to create our Active Directory group. In here, we'll make a web request out to our Graph API endpoint, and it's going to be a post. And we want to pass it a content type of application/JSON. And in our header, we're going to pass the authorization token. And the way that you do that is the header name of authorization, and then the header value of bearer space, and then our access token that we got from our call earlier in the workflow. Finally, in our body, we'll pass the content that we built in our dictionary, and then we will pass in some credentials, and then get our response content back in a text, and our response code back in an integer. This is just to confirm in the workflow that it was created successfully. I'm then logging that response code so I can see that in the workflow history. All right, cool. So we're all set up. Let's go ahead and run this workflow and see what happens. So here on my list, I'm going to go and run my workflow. I can see in my workflow history that I've got my bearer token. So my first web call worked successfully. And then down here at the end, I can see I got my response code 201, which means that the second call ran successfully. My workflow is now completed. And if I go over into my Active Directory groups and refresh, I'll now see my alpha test group was created right here. And I can see that it was created from the cloud, it has a type of security, and we created it today. Well, I hope this video has been helpful to you that are interested in creating groups in Active Directory through Nintex Workflow. Please feel free to let me know if there are any questions on this topic, and I'd be more than happy to try and help. Also, make sure to check out the Migration Center in the Nintex community, as we have a lot of content that's being added there on a regular basis related to moving to Office 365. If you're interested in learning more about workflow design, check out the Nintex University at learn.nintex.com.